Have you ever heard a story that completely changed the way you see life? Today, I'm going to take you to a small town where a simple, humble boy teaches us that true wealth is not in our pockets, but in our hearts. This story begins with an unexpected encounter that seems ordinary, but in the end, changed the life of a millionaire forever. Stay until the end and prepare yourself for a powerful reflection. It was a sunny morning in a small town where the streets were narrow and the sound of birds mixed with the voices of people at the local market. Slotin, a boy of just 10 years old, walked carefree down a dirt road. His shoes were worn out, but he kept his eyes full of curiosity and hope. That day, something caught his attention. A luxurious car, shining like a diamond in the sun. It was a rare sight to see in that place. Leaning against the window, a well-dressed man stared at the horizon, as if something was missing, even in the midst of so much luxury. Slotin stopped on the sidewalk, watching from afar. He had never seen anything so extravagant. The car was more than just an object. It seemed like a symbol of a world he didn't know. But instead of approaching it, he just stood there, hands in his pockets, admiring the scene with a mixture of fascination and distrust. The man, upon noticing the boy's attentive gaze, turned off the car and opened the door. His watch gleamed on his wrist. An expensive perfume filled the air. He approached Slotin with a curious smile. "Hello, kid. How are you?" the man asked, his tone gentle but full of authority. Slotin hesitated before answering, his heart racing. He didn't know exactly what to say. After a moment, he nodded. "Do you live around here?" The man continued to lower himself to the boy's level. Slotin nodded again, now looking the man directly in the eyes. Despite all the shine and sophistication, there was something empty in the stranger's gaze, something that not all the money seemed capable of filling. Little did Slotin know that this would be the beginning of a conversation that would change not only that man's life, but his own as well. The millionaire, whose name was Marco, was not used to encounters like this. In his world, surrounded by people who approached him only for money, seeing a boy so simple and yet so curious awakened something inside him. "You seem like a smart boy. Do you need anything?" Marco asked, trying to make conversation. Slotin shook his head, but Marco noticed a brief flicker of hesitation in the boy's eyes. It was the kind of reaction he recognized. Someone who needed help, but didn't know how to ask for it. "You know, I have plenty of money. I can help you if you want." Marco continued smiling, as if he were offering the most obvious solution in the world. Slotin, however, took a step back, crossing his arms. His answer was unexpected. "I don't need your money, sir." Marco was surprised. No one in his entire life had ever refused something he offered. He was used to solving everything with his wealth, problems, friendships, even moments of solitude. But there, in front of a boy who had so little, his offer seemed irrelevant. "Are you sure?" Marco insisted, now more curious than ever. "With a little money you could buy whatever you want. New clothes, toys, food, maybe even help your family." Slotin hesitated for a moment, but then looked up and answered, with a calmness that Marco had never seen before. "My family has what it needs, and I know I can work to achieve the things I want. I don't need easy money." Those words, said so simply, left Marco speechless. He couldn't understand how such a young boy could have such a clear vision of life, something that he himself, with years of experience and millions in the bank, couldn't achieve. "But why refuse?" Marco asked, almost as if he were venting. "Don't you want to have a better life?" Slotin smiled, a shy smile but full of conviction. "I do, sir. But I think a better life doesn't depend on money alone." Marco was silent. That answer, so simple and direct, echoed in his mind like a truth he had never considered. As he looked at the boy, something inside him began to change. He realized that perhaps he was facing a lesson he had never expected to learn. In that moment, Marco saw that the boy was not just a humble boy. He was someone who saw the world in a way that he, with all his wealth, had never been able to. And that intrigued him deeply. After Slotin's surprising answer, Marco got into the car and stood there for a few moments, motionless, with his hands on the steering wheel. On the outside, he still seemed the same confident and successful man he had been, always had been, but inside, something was starting to fall apart. As he looked in the rearview mirror, he saw the boy walking down the dirt road, disappearing around the corner. That scene, so simple and ordinary, made him uneasy. The boy's words echoed in his mind. A better life doesn't depend only on money. Marco, accustomed to solving problems with a check or a transfer, felt a strange discomfort. He had everything anyone could want: houses, cars, trips around the world. But he realized that, even so, he felt empty. That night, when he arrived at his luxurious penthouse in the big city, he tried to distract himself with his usual routine: an expensive dinner, a glass of imported wine, and the news on television. But nothing seemed enough. For the first time in a long time, Marco couldn't escape his own thoughts. He began to reflect on his life. He remembered all the times he had tried to fill that void with material goods: new cars, watches, parties. Everything seemed so insignificant now. How could a boy, with almost nothing, be so clear about what really mattered in life? Marco spent hours turning these ideas over. He thought about the contrast between his life and Slotin's. While he, with all his wealth, felt trapped in a relentless search for more, that boy seemed free. Free to dream, to fight for what he believed in, without losing his way. And then something unexpected happened. Marco felt, for the first time in many years, a mixture of admiration and envy. Admiration for Slotin's wisdom and envy for the peace of mind he demonstrated. "What's happening to me?" Marco muttered to himself, staring at his own image in the mirror. He realized he could no longer ignore the feeling that something was missing in his life. But what was it? Could it have to do with the boy's simplicity? With the idea that there was more to life than material achievements? The uneasiness grew until Marco made an impulsive decision. He needed to return to that small town. He needed to find Slotin again and better understand what the boy knew that he, with all his experience, had not yet learned. The next day, Marco put his commitments aside, something he rarely did, and hit the road towards the small town where he had met the boy. He felt that somehow this meeting had not been by chance. The millionaire was not sure what he was looking for, but something inside him told him that this journey was not just about Slotin. It was about himself and what he really wanted from life. And so, with his mind full of questions and his heart full of expectation, Marco returned to the place where it all began. When Marco arrived in the small town again, he felt a strange familiarity in the air. The quiet rhythm of the streets, the sound of children playing, the simple aromas coming from the houses. It all seemed so far from his busy life, but at the same time, it was comforting. He parked the car near the main square and got out, adjusting his jacket with a slight anxiety. His eyes scanned the place for Slotin. He was not sure what he would say to the boy, but he felt an urgent need to understand more about his worldview. Finally, he spotted the boy, sitting on the edge of a fountain. Slotin was playing with a small stone, throwing it into the water, and watching the waves it created. The smile on his face was genuine, carefree, as if nothing in the world could disturb him. Marco approached slowly, and the boy noticed his presence before he said anything. "You're back," Slotin said, with a simplicity that surprised Marco. "Yes, I'm back," Marco replied, sitting down next to him. "I think our conversation affected me in a way I didn't expect." Slotin looked at him curiously, but said nothing. Marco took a deep breath before continuing. "I spent my whole life believing that money was the answer to everything. It solved problems, created opportunities. But after I met you, I realized that maybe I was wrong. You made me question things I had never stopped to think about." The boy remained silent, but there was something in his eyes, a calm, a wisdom that encouraged Marco to continue. "How can you be so calm?" Marco asked, almost as if he was venting. "Aren't you worried about the future? About the difficulties?" Slotin smiled slightly before answering. "Of course I am. But I've learned that the most important things don't depend only on what we have. They depend on who we are and what we are willing to do for others." Those words, said so simply, struck Marco like a truth he couldn't ignore. He felt a tightness in his chest, as if something was being unraveled inside him. "And don't you feel like you could do more? Be more? If you had more money?" Marco insisted, trying to understand. "Maybe," Slotin replied, shrugging. "But I don't want money to change who I am. I prefer to fight for what I believe in, even if it's harder." Marco remained silent, absorbing those words. He realized that the boy wasn't just refusing money. He was protecting something that Marco had lost a long time ago. Authenticity, purpose, true freedom. "You're very wise for someone your age," Marco admitted with a sad smile. "Maybe even wiser than me." Slotin laughed, but not arrogantly, but with the lightness of someone who doesn't take life too seriously. "I'm not wise, sir. I only know what's important to me." At that moment, Marco felt he was faced with a profound truth, something he had always sought, but never knew where to find. He looked at the boy and realized that this meeting wasn't just a chance to help Slotin. It was a chance to reconnect with himself. The millionaire had spent hours talking to the boy that day. He hadn't come there to give him something. It was to learn. And as Slotin talked about his life, his simple dreams, and his outlook on the world, Marco felt something inside him begin to change. As he said goodbye, the millionaire knew he still had a lot to think about. But one thing was certain: Slotin had planted a seed in his heart, a new perspective that he could no longer ignore. As he walked away, Marco looked back and saw the boy smiling again, throwing stones into the water as if the world were simple and beautiful. And for the first time in many years, Marco wondered if true wealth was, after all, something he had ignored all his life. In the days that followed his meeting with Slotin, Marco could not get the boy's words out of his head. He found himself reliving every detail of their conversation, every simple and direct lesson that Slotin had shared. There was something deeply uncomfortable, and at the same time liberating, about rethinking his priorities. Marco, who had always believed that wealth was the ultimate symbol of success, began to question what he had really achieved. He looked around his luxurious home, expensive furniture, rare artwork, everything impeccably organized. But somehow it felt empty. That night, Marco sat in his living room with the lights dimmed and wrote a list. It was something he hadn't done in years, maybe decades. He divided the sheet of paper into 2 columns. In the first, he wrote down everything he had achieved materially: cars, real estate, lucrative businesses. In the other, he tried to list moments of true happiness. It was then that he realized something he had never faced before. While the achievement column was full, the happiness column was almost empty. He felt a weight on his chest, as if all those riches were nothing more than ornaments covering a deep void. The next morning, Marco made a decision that seemed crazy to the man he'd been not so long ago. He canceled important appointments, business meetings, and began looking for ways to use his wealth in a different way. He reached out to local charities, small organizations that were truly making a difference in underprivileged communities. He didn't want to just give money away. He wanted to be present, to understand the people he was helping. Marco also began to devote time to his family, something he had neglected for years. He called his younger sister, whom he had not seen in months, and invited her to dinner. He visited his mother, who had always complained about his absence. And for the first time in a long time, he listened more than he spoke. At the same time, he could not forget Slotin. He felt that he still had something to learn from the boy, and he wanted to give back in a meaningful way. He knew that Slotin would not accept money, but he thought of another way to help him. A few weeks later, Marco returned to the small town. This time he had a plan. He found Slotin in the square, as before, playing with other children. The boy seemed the same, smiling, calm, full of a wisdom that impressed Marco. "Sir, what are you doing here again?" Slotin asked, curious but without surprise in his tone. Marco smiled, sitting down next to the boy. "I came back because I learned a lot from you, but also because I want to give you something that I believe you will accept." Slotin frowned suspiciously. "I already told you I don't need money." Marco laughed, shaking his head. "I know, and it's not money I'm offering. I want to give you a chance to study at a good school. Not to change who you are, but to help you achieve your dreams." The boy looked at Marco, surprised. He remained silent for a few moments, thinking about the proposal. Finally, he smiled and said, "If it helps me help others in the future, I accept." Marco felt immense relief, not because his offer was accepted, but because, for the first time, Marco felt like he was using his wealth for something truly meaningful. In the months that followed, Marco kept a close eye on Slotin, making sure he had the opportunities he needed. And at the same time, Marco continued his own transformation. He began investing in projects that valued people rather than material possessions. He realized that true wealth was not in hoarding, but in sharing. And as Marco watched Slotin grow and prosper, he felt like he was finally finding the peace he had sought all his life. Now, Marco understood what Slotin had taught him so simply. The value of life lies not in the things we own, but in the impact we have on the world around us. And that, he knew, was the greatest fortune anyone could ever achieve. The years passed, and both Slotin and Marco went their separate ways, but now with a special bond that connected them forever. Slotin seized the opportunity to study at a good school, absorbing each lesson as if it were a gift. He was known for his humility and the way he inspired his peers and teachers with his outlook on life. Over time, Slotin not only gained academic knowledge, but also became a leader in his community. He used what he learned to help his town, creating simple but impactful projects that improved the lives of those around him. Marco, on the other hand, also transformed profoundly. He abandoned the relentless pursuit of material wealth and began investing in initiatives that truly made a difference in people's lives. His name was no longer associated only with lucrative businesses, but was remembered for his generosity and empathy. Despite his new goals, Marco never forgot Slotin. He watched the boy grow up from afar, proud of the impact he was making on his community. But more than that, Marco knew that Slotin had given him something much greater than he could offer in return, a new purpose in life. One day, Marco decided to visit Slotin again. When he arrived in the small town, he found the young man leading a community meeting in the same square where they had met years before. The humble boy had grown into an adult who was respected and admired by all. "Slotin," Marco called out with a warm smile. Slotin turned around and, upon recognizing him, smiled broadly. "Mr. Marco, it's so good to see you." The two greeted each other with a sincere hug, full of mutual respect. Marco looked around, observing the people gathered and the visible changes in the community. "It seems like you're transforming this place," Marco said in admiration. "I'm just trying to give back what I received," Slotin replied humbly. "It all started with that conversation in the square." Marco laughed, remembering the impact of that encounter. "I think you taught me more than I could have imagined." They spent hours talking, reminiscing, and sharing their journeys. Marco realized that Slotin had maintained the essence that made him so special. His belief that the most important things in life cannot be bought, but rather built with love, respect, and purpose. When Marco said goodbye, he felt even more complete. He knew that the journey that began with that encounter with the humble boy had shaped who he was today. And as he drove home, he thought about the legacy that Slotin was leaving, not only in his community, but also in his life. This story, full of simplicity and depth, taught both Marco and others who knew him that true wealth is not in the things we own, but in the lives we touch. And so it was that a humble boy, with a simple gesture and a clear vision of life, transformed the life of a millionaire and, indirectly, the lives of many others. After all, the greatest changes begin with small gestures and a heart full of purpose. What about you? Have you ever thought about how you can impact someone's life with a simple gesture? If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs inspiration, and leave your opinion in the comments. Let's create a chain of reflection and change together. After saying goodbye to Slotin, Marco returned home with a feeling of fulfillment that he had never experienced before. He knew his life had changed profoundly since the day he met that boy in the small town. But now, more than ever, he felt it was time to take even more meaningful action. Marco began to rethink all of his possessions and investments. He realized that he had accumulated so much, but that little of it actually contributed to the good of others. Inspired by Slotin's words and the impact the boy was already making, Marco decided it was time to turn his fortune into a force for good. He founded an organization dedicated to providing educational opportunities for young people from underprivileged communities. Not just scholarships, but also mentoring programs, internships, and psychological support. He wanted to make sure that young people had not only the resources, but also the guidance they needed to thrive. The foundation was named after the boy who had changed his life, Slotin Institute for the Future. In its early years, the foundation helped dozens of young people get into college and build brilliant careers. More than that, Marco personally engaged with many of these young people, sharing his own story of transformation and showing them that even with big mistakes in the past, change is always possible. One day, while Marco was visiting one of the schools his foundation supported, he received a touching surprise. Slotin, now an adult and a leader in his community, stopped by to personally thank Marco for the impact he had made. "Mr. Marco," Slotin began with the same humble smile as before, "everything you're doing is incredible. But I need you to know one thing. This isn't just about me. It's about what you've found within yourself." Marco was silent for a moment, reflecting on those words. "You're right, Slotin. You taught me something I never would have learned on my own. But it was your vision, your simplicity, that showed me what really matters, and that changed everything for me." The two spent hours talking about how their paths intertwined and how a simple encounter in a park changed their lives forever. As he walked home that night, Marco realized something powerful. True change doesn't happen in grand gestures or initiatives alone. It starts in simple moments, in small acts of courage and truth. He knew his journey wasn't over yet, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. Not just to help others, but to live a life of purpose, a life where he could finally find peace. What about you? Have you ever thought about how your actions, no matter how small, can change not only your life, but the lives of others? Let us know in the comments how this story impacted you, and share it with someone who needs this message of hope and transformation. Together, we can build a world where small gestures create big changes. Years later, both Slotin and Marco have become symbols of transformation in their respective journeys. The small town where it all began flourished thanks to the projects that Slotin led and the continued support of the foundation that Marco created. The impact of the meeting between the two spread far beyond the borders of that community. The children of the town grew up with a new vision of what is possible to achieve with dedication, humility, and collaboration. Inspired by Slotin, many young people began to get involved in social projects, helping each other and bringing hope to places that were previously forgotten. Marco, for his part, found in simplicity a happiness that he never imagined possible. He dedicated himself to traveling to communities around the world, always with the same purpose: to listen, learn, and help. He said that his greatest fortune was the teachings that people taught him in each place. Once, in an interview with a newspaper, Marco was asked what motivated his actions. He smiled, looking at the reporter, and replied, "A boy taught me that true wealth is not in the things we own, but in the lives we touch." He was right, and I hope to continue touching lives as long as I can. Slotin, now a grown man with his own family, decided to visit Marco at one of his properties, not to ask for help, but to personally thank him for everything he had done for so many people. When he arrived, he found Marco tending a small garden, something he had started doing to slow down and reflect. Slotin approached with a smile on his face. "You're always planting, aren't you?" Slotin joked. Marco laughed and replied, "Yes, and this time literally. But deep down, we're always planting something, don't you think? Words, actions, everything leaves seeds." The two sat under the shade of a tree and talked for hours, reminiscing about the impact of that day in the square and how their lives had changed since then. "I've always thought," Slotin said, "that the most important things in life are the ones you can't buy. But today, I see that the most important things are also the ones you pass on." Marco nodded, moved. Slotin and Marco's story has become an inspiration to many. Books, documentaries, and lectures began to share the transformative power of a simple gesture. People around the world were touched by the lesson that true happiness lies in authenticity, empathy, and the ability to help others. In the end, their journey was more than a story of personal transformation. It was a universal reminder that no matter how humble our lives may be, actions, they can generate changes that echo through generations. And so, Slotin and Marco showed the world that the most lasting wealth is not the one we accumulate, but the one we share. If you've come this far, this story must have touched your heart, just as it has touched the hearts of so many others. How about being part of this chain of change? Share this message with someone special and leave a comment below to let us know how it inspired you. And remember, sometimes the smallest gesture can create the biggest impact.